The early days of electronic music was mainly a time of privileged composers invited to take part in electronic explorations. Before analog synthesizers became affordable and accessible for musicians, electronic music history tends to focus on experimental composers' works produced throughout the 1940s and 1950s. This was the period when many of the basic techniques and technologies of electronic music originated. After the Second World War, the explosion of prosperity and technology created many new possibilities, and the development of electronic music during this period reflects this. Some of the first private studios got established and set a blast of exploration and innovation. National broadcasters served as an incubator for much development in electronic music, in many cases provided equipment, facilities, funding and technical support for projects that might not have been commercially viable. Sounds were altered through techniques like filtering, reverberation and looping. The arrival of tape recorders allowed for detailed and micro-level editing, splicing of sounds and less reliance on the performance skills of the composer. Everything described in this screen is in some sense still in use today, perhaps in different form, rather than a tape recorder. The BBC started its Radiophonic Workshop in 1958, focusing more on developing music and sound effects for its productions than on supporting the work of experimental composers. But what are the most important landmarks for electronic music going mainstream? Music historian Tom Holmes argues that the Philips Pavilion at the World's Fair of 1958 provided the first mass exposure of electronic music. A footfall of 2 million spectators visited the immersive stomach of the pavilion, hearing Varèse's multimedia work Poème électronique, while Xenakis' filler piece Concrète PH spread over 350 loudspeakers. But we can start by crediting Theremin-loaded B-movies earlier in the 1950s as stirring some consciousness of electronic music. Film sound designers were already ahead of experimental music composers since the 1920s and 1930s, exploring recording effects and the optical film soundtrack as a method of sound synthesis. When composer Bernard Herrmann scored the film The Day the Earth Stood Still, he already had a taste of what an alien invasion could sound like. This is as in 1938 he had conducted the live music for Orson Welles' Halloween radio broadcast The War of the Worlds. His scoring was groundbreaking, using an odd combination of instruments to portray an uneasy feeling from the opening credits. But the instrument that set the score apart from all previous scores was the theremin, one of the first electronic musical instruments. Other film composers copied Herrmann's use of the theremin, and the instrument has been associated since with science fiction and thriller movies. So the transition period before electronic music became mainstream came through film music. Nonetheless, the first all-electronic score to a mass-released film got attributed to the movie Forbidden Planet. The score was created by Bebe and Louis Barron, the husband and wife team with the distinction of being creators of the first work for magnetic tape composed in America. Louis and Bebe Barron produced many film soundtracks aside from Forbidden Planet, working with recorded materials and custom-made circuits. They were integral to early art music experiments in the music of magnetic tape, the projects initiated by John Cage, and also worked to the all-electronic score for the 10-minute art film Bells of Atlantis. When they secured a commission to work on electronic sounds for Forbidden Planet, they scored the whole movie in 3 months. A rough cut with their electronic tonalities proved so popular at test screenings that it became the basis for the full release. In an interview, Bebe Barron recalled, "We used many circuits from Norbert Weiner's book Cybernetic. We recorded and amplified the electronic activity and endlessly processed it. We thought of our circuits as characters in a script. Once they died, we could never revive them. We could just sit back and the music coming from the circuits would take over. Throughout the 1950s and 1970s transition period, greater adoption of electronic music in film, television, and popular music played out. The peak of electronic music in film came in the early 1970s. It was paralleled with the greater availability of analog synthesizers at the time and the mass production of Moogs, ARPs, and synthes. By the early 1970s, synths were becoming a standard feature for musicians. Films in the 1970s also saw starring roles for synthesizers themselves. A Moog modular was a prop for Mick Jagger in the movie Performance, and an ARP 2500 in Close Encounters of the Third Kind formed the human-alien musical communication duet, and ARP engineer Phil Dodds even played a part in the movie. Through the 1980s and 1990s, new recording technologies opened up creative possibilities and underpinned the emergence of new musical genres, and with the availability of cheap music production technologies such as MIDI, the mainstream has been reached.